We are living in a time, in human history with unprecedented access to highly potent reinforcing drugs and behaviors. And it's really made us all vulnerable to the problem of addiction, even those of us who do not have any kind of innate biological vulnerability.
Jesus in my mind, in this world
Yeah, maybe what I could start out with was just this quote that was about your book that was on NPR. No matter what you find yourself overindulging in, from the internet to food to work to sex, you'll find this book riveting, scary, cogent, and cleverly argued. And that's about your book, Dopamine Nation.
Yeah.
So I thought, maybe where we could start out is a little bit spot that is maybe a little bit different than some other places, and find out about little Anna Lembke. Am I saying your last name right?
Yeah, that was right.
Okay, so did you grow up in a family with, or a neighborhood in which addiction was an issue? What were things like for you as a child?
Oh yeah, great question. So I grew up in a family with a high functioning binge drinker for a father. My father was a surgeon and could go for months at a time and not drink alcohol. But when he did, he would go on benders. And so, I have vivid memories of coming home from elementary school with a friend, going to the backyard. My dad was passed out underneath the hammock, not in the hammock, but underneath the hammock, and saying, my friend, let's go to your house. And also lots of fighting between my parents, much of it focused around his drinking. A family vacation that we took to Disneyland. Actually, it was Disney World, in which my father disappeared for 4 days and was drinking. So, and I really loved my dad. He was this wonderfully charismatic person, a real original. And he was very fond of me too. So we had a special bond, but he was an inconstant presence in our lives. And there were long periods when he was, drinking heavily, absent, morose. So that was sort of what I grew up with, as well as I would say, a codependent mother. These are all things that I really didn't realize at the time, but realized in retrospect.
So did that inform your desire to become a psychiatrist and to work in issues of addiction, or was this something you were surprised to find that you were working in?
Yeah, I would say, if anything, I consciously avoided working with people with addiction. I hadn't been taught almost anything in medical school and not much in psychiatry residency either, about addiction. So I didn't have many tools. In the 90s, we were really taught that addiction was a willpower problem and a social problem, not that it was a medical problem or a brain problem. So when I went into psychiatry, I explicitly said, I will treat anybody, but not people with addiction. And what I discovered was that there weren't any people left when I made that exclusionary criteria. Also, I realized that my patients weren't really getting better when I was just sort of throwing pills at them without looking at the problem of addiction that so many of them had. And so it was a combination of sort of those realizations, and then just sort of starting to work with people with addiction and finding that they were really delightful and that they got better and that they stayed better and that their families got better. And I was like, oh, this is fun. These people are great and this is rewarding work. And it just kind of went from there. It also was sort of a default because it was, these were patients that nobody else wanted to work with. I wasn't alone in my initial avoidance of the population. Most of that due to ignorance, that we don't, as physicians, get good education on addiction. So we're afraid, really, because we don't think we can help people with addiction, which is not at all true. But these are all things that I had to learn slowly over several decades.
Yeah, that's interesting. I'm a big fan of Bill Miller's, and he has kind of a similar origin story of, like, I don't know, they didn't tell me anything about it. And so I talked to these guys, and I didn't know all the stuff I was supposed to know about these people. And then later I read the literature and I was like, well, that's not what they were like in Minneapolis.
Right.
So, you're not prepared. And I think there's some hesitancy to get involved in this population and so on.
Mhm.
Yeah, I'd like to maybe talk a little bit about dopamine. Your book is entitled Dopamine Nation.
Yeah.
So, and maybe even before we get into the specifics of dopamine itself, why this book right now? What do you think is happening in our nation and in our world that's making addiction such an important topic?
Yeah. So, I mean, one of the biggest risk factors for addiction is simple access to drugs. If you live in a environment where you have easy, ready access to highly potent, highly reinforcing drugs and behaviors, you're more likely to try them and you're more likely to get addicted. And we are living in a time, in human history with unprecedented access to highly potent reinforcing drugs and behaviors. And it's really made us all vulnerable to the problem of addiction, even those of us who do not have any kind of innate biological vulnerability. So there is a variability across the population in terms of innate vulnerability to the problem. And I would say that, the data suggests that since the beginning of human history, about 10% of the human population will develop some kind of serious addiction in their lifetime. But now that we're in this drugified world, those numbers are going way up. And even if we don't struggle with a severe addiction, almost all of us can identify with a minor overconsumption, compulsive overconsumption problem. So I think this problem of addiction has really become, the modern problem and will remain a significant public health problem for the foreseeable future.
Yeah, the sheer access to the number and the types of drugs
Right.
is has hugely exploded. And
Yes.
then we've got these other things that aren't necessarily classified as drugs that our smartphones,
Mhm.
pornography, refined food, and,
That's right.
and all these other things that are still using that dopamine system
Right.
to capture us in a sense, right?
Exactly. I mean, again, if you look at the sort of the four features of something that's highly addictive, it's easy access, large quantities, novelty, so lots of variations on
Mm.
that theme, and lots of different drugs to kind of meet everybody's unique lock and key because we all have our own drug of choice. And then potency, technology has allowed us to take almost every old-fashioned drug and make it more potent. And then, of course, there are these new drugs that didn't even exist before. Digital drugs are a prime example. The internet, making things like pornography more accessible, more potent, infinite. So all of those things make it a challenging world to live in.
Mhm. For sure. Yeah, I thought your book did a great job of just including a lot of different stories and a lot of different perspectives on what addiction could be.
Yeah,
And I would definitely encourage anyone who's enjoying this to check that book out. It's one of the best books on addiction that I've read in a long time.
thank you.
Um, let's talk a little bit about dopamine. So, you mentioned that that's not the only uh, neurochemical that's involved in addiction, but it's certainly one of the biggies. So, what's going on in the brain of someone who is addicted or who is getting addicted?
Yeah, I think the best way to understand what happens in the brain as we go from recreational or adaptive use of a drug, and I use the term drug very broadly to include behaviors as well. As we go from adaptive or recreational use to addictive use, is to really imagine that in your brain there's a balance, like a board on a fulcrum, and that balance represents or is a metaphor for how we process pleasure and pain. Because what neuroscience has shown is that pleasure and pain are processed in the very same part of the brain, which is in and of itself, pretty interesting. And that pleasure and pain work like opposite sides of a balance. When we do something pleasurable, we tip to the side of pleasure. Dopamine is released in our brain's reward pathway. Dopamine is a chemical our brain makes, it's a neurotransmitter, and it's intimately involved in the experience of reward, pleasure, and motivation. But the overriding rule governing this balance is that it wants to remain level or preserve homeostasis. And any deviation from neutrality is essentially the definition of stress. And once we deviate from neutrality, our brains will work hard to restore homeostasis. So when we release dopamine in the reward pathway, our brain will downregulate our own dopamine production and transmission, involute our dopamine receptors as a way to bring things back to balance. But it does that by overshooting. And in fact, decreasing dopamine levels to below baseline levels, or I imagine this as these gremlins hopping on the pain side of the balance to bring it level again, but they stay on until it's tipped an equal and opposite amount to the side of pain before going back to baseline. And that's how it works. There's a price for every pleasure, and the cost is some kind of period of pain. It can be physiologic, like the hangover, after we've been drinking heavily, but it's very often more of a subtle cumulative effect of psychological symptoms like irritability, anxiety, depression, intrusive thoughts of wanting our drug. The other rule governing this balance is that with repeated exposure to highly reinforcing drugs, that initial pleasurable response gets weaker and shorter, but the after response gets stronger and longer. In other words, the balance remembers. And those gremlins, yeah, it's evil. It's evil in a way. We can talk about how it's really kind of makes total sense. Okay. But the gremlins, once created, they don't disappear. They're like waiting in the wings of the base of that balance, eager to hop on again. So with a secondary exposure, a third or 100th exposure, they're now, boom, right away. And then that after response gets stronger and longer over time. So that ultimately, if we're bombarding our reward pathway with these dopamine releasing drugs and behaviors, we accumulate so many gremlins on the pain side of the balance that they were essentially walking around with the balance tilted to the side of pain. They're camped out there. And now we need to use our drug just to get out of the pain state. Now we need to use our drug to feel normal. We need more and more potent forms. We're essentially at war with our gremlins. And our focus is really then narrowed and other things are no longer enjoyable. And this physiologic drive, once our balance is tipped here, the drive to want to get that drug to restore homeostasis is overwhelming. There's almost, it's very, very difficult to resist that pull, and we're all vulnerable to it. And that's the physiology that essentially makes people relapse even weeks or months after they've abstained from their drug, because if they're still walking around with a balance tilted to the side of pain, it's like every day is a battle.
Yeah, and just to escape the pain.
That's right. Just to escape. That's right. Just to escape the pain. And of course, when we're in that kind of pain, it's truly hard to believe that it will ever go away. And it feels in that moment like the only thing that will take that pain away is to use our drug of choice. And it does work. I mean, that's the thing. It does restore homeostasis for a brief period, but then we add one more gremlin to the balance. What we need to do is abstain long enough for those gremlins to hop off and for homeostasis to be restored and to start upregulating our own dopamine production. But typically that takes weeks to months. It's not something that happens over hours to days.
I want to go back a second. So, I mentioned that, from my experience as someone in recovery, I feel that it's a bit evil, and it's putting things, it's making things very difficult for me. Yeah. You mentioned that it's not. Is there an adaptive aspect to this as well?
So a couple things. It's actually, the system is pure genius if you imagine that we evolved for a world of scarcity. And for most of human existence, we have lived in a world of scarcity and ever-present danger, where we, in order to survive, we had to be completely driven and never satisfied with what we had, willing to walk tens of kilometers to find that next drink of water or that next source of food. And so a balance, if you imagine, if we have a pleasure pain system where we felt pleasure and then we kind of just went back here, well, I mean, that's not super motivating, is it? Like, it's like, oh, pleasure, that's good, but just being here is good. But if we had a system that said, oh, well, here you go, here's some pleasure, and then here's what follows that pleasure, boy, would that be motivating, right? It'd be like, I'm really going to go get that thing, because now I'm feeling crappy right now. If we wait long enough, restore. But that is an amazing motivator. And it's really the dopamine deficit state in a way, rather than the dopamine rush itself, that drives the willingness to sacrifice so much to get the drug of choice. The other reason that it's a genius system is because it works on the opposite side too. If the initial stimulus is pain, like we cut our finger and it tilts to the pain side. If it just went like from pain to here, okay, I guess that would be okay. But what our body does, you get pain, and then our body goes, oh my gosh, let's make more opioids, let's relieve the pain for this person. So we get to go there. And like, that's that's great, right? That's a wonderful mercy that in the wake of pain, our body will make these, kind of protect. Really, that's why we have opioids. We make our own opioids. We make our own cannabinoids, right? We make all these feel-good hormones, dopamine. So in a way, they're there to compensate for the pain of life that we have to endure. And if we didn't have that, I don't know that we could survive what we have to survive, except that in this world, we're really insulated from pain, right? We're not out there, getting chased by lions. We're not even really moving our bodies very much. So the physicality of our lives is almost non-existent for most people, unless you intentionally seek it out, like you did this morning when you went for a bike ride, which is exactly what we need to do, right? We need to now go find these exertional, challenging, painful things, because that's how we were evolved. And we weren't meant to just sit around all day and not experience pain.
Yeah. So what I'm picking up from this is that on the one hand, it may actually be a motivator for innovation, right? But it may give us the ability to persevere through difficult times, to get even higher levels of innovation and complexity or whatever in our lives, because that pleasure pain balance is going to come back to pleasure after we've endured something difficult.
That's right.
It motivates us to keep going and persist. The 3,000 times we tried to make an airplane and it didn't fly.
Yeah, that's right. That's right. Humans are the ultimate seekers. We are always striving, looking for that next thing, and that's healthy and good, and just simply who we are. That's how we're wired. We desire is part of our DNA. The problem is that, with our technological innovation, we've just created so many things that bypass the work part and go immediately to the reward part. And that's the danger, because that's the kind of thing that we're not really wired for. Something that you can take that's really potent and that lasts a lot longer than anything our body could make, and bypasses the work part and just boop, slams that pleasure pain balance hard to the side of pleasure. Then we're going to pay this enormous cost, and with repeated use, ultimately end up changing our hedonic set point to the side of pain, which is why I think we're seeing increased rates of depression, anxiety, suicide the world over, but especially in rich nations. I think it's this overabundance, the way in which we're insulated from painful experiences. I think we're essentially individually and collectively resetting our hedonic set point into a dopamine deficit state.
Yeah, things have gotten so good.
Yeah, that's right. Yeah. Literally, we've reached this tipping point.
So I wanted to ask you about something that I've felt with things that are addictive that I didn't quite hear in your model, and see what you think. So one thing I've noticed is that, as I'm eating the particularly tortilla chips and salsa, that it's not that I have the tortilla chips and salsa and then the fulcrum, goes down, and then I feel bad, and then I have another one. But as I'm experiencing it, I'm experiencing a desire for more, even in the act of doing the thing that's releasing the dopamine. Is that
right?
Is that something that can happen as well?
Yes. So there's a bit of controversy around this phenomenon in the neuroscience literature, but there are some neuroscientists, including, I believe, George Koob, who speculate that the downregulation and the dopamine deficit state, where the gremlins hop on and the neuroadaptation starts and tilts us to the side of balance, essentially happens instantly. It happens immediately. So even as you're eating that first tortilla, it's not like you eat the tortilla and then you wait a while, and then it's like, even as you're eating the first tortilla, you are already in a dopamine deficit. Like, it's recalibrated that quickly, and that your desire for a second tortilla is driven by this kind of immediate neuroadaptation in order to try to maintain those levels or get back to that pleasure state.
Yeah, and I guess that would explain benders as well, right? Where you're just,
Yeah.
it's not that you have a drink and then you begin to come down and you feel bad, but people are
Yeah.
pushing it and pushing it and pushing it. There's something about the act itself that's propelling you to the next drink.
Yeah. Well, I mean, some of that too is learned behavior, like you know where
Mm,
you're trying to get
right.
because you have this euphoric recall. But because the gremlins never entirely disappear and they remember, once you've developed that tolerance, the moment you start drinking, they're already on there. So now, originally, when you started drinking, let's say that very first drink, you kind of got this nice thing going on and maybe a little bit, this, but not bad. But once you're down the road and you've created these neural loops and the memory for it, the moment you start drinking, you've got the army of gremlins, boop, and then now you're here. So now you're already having to like pound, right, to get to the place that used to just take you one drink.
That's super helpful. The other phenomenon that I've experienced and other people have described, I talked to somebody yesterday who was a drug dealer, and he said he had a woman and her daughter in his house to buy drugs. And as they're in the house talking to their drug dealer, they're going, I really need to stop this.
Yeah.
And I've experienced this as well, that as I'm doing the addictive behavior, I'm going, I
Mhm.
really don't want to do this.
Right.
I've talked to people who've told me they're calling their dealer going, I hope you don't pick up. that
Yeah.
that there's this experience of I know that I'm marching towards this thing, and it almost feels like it's not me doing it, and I'm
Yeah. Yeah.
wishing
Yeah.
that I'm not. I wish
Yeah.
that I'm not doing this, but I
Mhm.
can feel already that I'm headed that way.
Yeah, yeah, no.
It,
So I mean, and that's the power of the physiologic drive when basically our lizard brain takes over and that reward pathway or that pleasure pain balance just becomes the dominant reflex. So, we're tipped to the side of pain, that incredible drive to get the drug in order to restore at least some modicum of homeostasis. And when we're in this state, we can rationally know that we do not want to use our drug, but our rationality cannot overcome the incredibly ancient physiologic need to restore homeostasis. That is so
Mhm.
overwhelming and so powerful that it can sometimes honestly take an act of God or grace or something, to sort of disconnect that circuit. Rationality alone won't work. One of the ways to think about this too is that the prefrontal cortex, which is sort of the storytelling part of our brain, the part, and it's the gray matter right behind our forehead. It's the part of our brain that can anticipate future consequences. We think what happens, in a healthy brain is that the prefrontal cortex and the reward pathway, which is down in the lower brain regions and that phylogenetically much older part of the limbic brain, often called the lizard brain, that's conserved across species and throughout evolution, that basically the prefrontal cortex and the reward pathway are talking to each other, and we're able to like think through the drink. But what can happen in the disease of addiction is you essentially get a disconnect between prefrontal cortex and reward pathways. And then you've just got the gremlins are just ruling the day, and you can kind of watch it, but you can't stop it.
Interesting. Yeah, that's a nice mental picture, I think, of kind of what's happening
Yeah.
in those situations. I want to talk a little bit about some of the ways that we can break the chains of addiction. But before that, you talked about something in your book, that the God within philosophy, and that this is part of kind of what's existing in our culture right now that may be also contributing to the amount of addiction that we're seeing. Can you talk a little bit about that?
Yeah. So, that's, I think that you're referring to Ross Douthat's work that I mentioned in the book,
Mhm.
where he talks about the ways in which modern spirituality and sort of new age religions are geared toward making people feel good without necessarily holding people accountable for their behaviors. And it's a kind of, this sort of myth that sort of endless empathy alone will heal, when in fact, what we need to do is change behavior. And that all the empathy in the world, although that's not a bad starting place for many, is not enough.
Mhm.
I also quote Philip Reef, who says that religious man was born to be saved and psychological man was born to be pleased. And it's just sort of a nice way of saying, that there does seem to be this trend both in psychology and in some spiritual circles where it's just all about what makes me feel good rather than, how can I live a good life and be a worthy person and find meaning. And one of the things I love about the 12 steps is that the 12 steps is all about, empathy and de-shaming, but really holds people accountable and says, you are responsible for your life, and you can't choose whether or not, you have addiction, but you can choose whether or not you will try to get better and try to accept treatment or try to have a spiritual transformation that might be at the core of your recovery pathway. And to do that, you need to, for example, tell the truth, and you need to experience shame and regret, and you need to, be accountable for your actions. So I think that's why the 12 steps is really powerful philosophy, and interestingly is being incorporated in quite a few religious organizations. So for example, there are some church movements who are now explicitly incorporating 12 steps alongside the Bible, for example, as a way to promote healing. And it's interesting to see that.
Mhm. Yeah, I think what's interesting too about what you're talking about, this chasing after happiness, is if we look at that balance, then if you're chasing after happiness, ultimately what you're going to get is more pain.
That's right.
Whereas if you're chasing towards meaning
Right.
and responsibility and living a meaningful and moral life, you may experience some pain, but because of the fulcrum, it's gonna tilt. You're actually, I guess, unintentionally going to end up happier, even though that wasn't the goal of what you were trying to do.
Yes, that's exactly right. And I think a big piece, and I agree 100% with what you just said. I think you've got it exactly right. And I think the other interesting piece of it, which is, I think, further along in recovery and in our own spiritual pathway or moral evolution, is that eventually we get to a place where we realize, I can't even necessarily control when I get to be happy. Like those moments will come not at my bidding, but just, moments of, let's call it grace, or moments of peace, or moments of joy that we don't, when we're really experiencing happiness, we don't really actually get to decide when that comes, right? And we have to get away from the notion that we can tilt the balance one way or the other, frankly, in order to get the gumball. Like it doesn't work like a gumball machine. But what we can do is live moral lives. We can live meaningful lives. We can recognize that we can find meaning in our suffering, and that in fact, suffering is a pathway to meaning and purpose. And then, try to catch those moments like butterflies, but they're hard to catch. But when they come, it just, enjoy it. And then it's not the thing, as you say, that you're seeking.
Yeah, two things come to mind with that. One is this idea as a Christian of God as my shepherd. So I'm not the sheep who's running around looking for the best fields, where in addiction I'm chasing what's going to make me happy in the moment, that I'm submitting to the authority of this pastor who's the good shepherd, who has my best interest in mind. And some of that, he might lead me through some areas that seem difficult to me. And when I get to that pasture that's more beautiful, or I lay down beside the still waters, it wasn't me that got me there, but it was my trust in God to do that. And then the other thing is obviously Christ's command to pick up your cross and follow me. And whoever wants to save their life will lose it. If you're willing to lose your life, that's actually how you gain it. So it's not this endless chasing after happiness. And so maybe part of what's happening in recovery is I'm giving up my own authority and my own autonomy over my moments of happiness, and saying, I'm going to trust that God has some of this.
Yeah, I think that's right. And I would say, so much of my book and the neuroscience that I describe really is a reductionistic model of how the brain works. And yet I do believe that there's a way in which really outside of mind and brain, there's mercy.
Mhm.
And that is the spiritual piece that is, really, I mean, there's the neurobiology and all of that. And I want people to understand that it's important, it's a driver. But I think one of the ways that we actually can break the cycle, as you say, break the chains of addiction, is like a meta to this phenomenon, this brain phenomenon. And it happens in our relationship with our higher power, that we can break this cycle through something, outside of ourselves.
Can you talk about that a little bit more? What do you mean when you say it's something meta and outside of are you talking about outside of the material reductionistic understanding
Yeah.
of addiction, or?
Yes, that's right. So, I mean, again, I think the neuroscience is powerful. I think
Mhm.
understanding the pleasure pain balance and the different parts of the brain and how dopamine works, it's all super powerful. And there are things that we can do, like pressing on the pain side of the balance, tolerating discomfort. Like I say things like exercise in order as an indirect way to get dopamine, and all of that's good and healthy. But I really think that there's also this way. I mean, addiction is a loss of autonomy and choice, essentially, as we become slaves to our physiology.
Another irony, right? That I was chasing being in control of
Yes.
my moods and my feelings,
Yes.
and then I end up losing it.
And you become a slave
Yeah.
to your own physiology. But what's fascinating to me is that there is this way in which we can break that cycle, which involves just something that occurs outside of this. It's a way in which we can get perspective on ourselves, and like actually look down on ourselves and have insight and awareness, and the ability then to change our lives. I'm not articulating that very well. I mean, it's basically a spiritual transformation or a spiritual pathway, however people find that or define that. But there is and I'm trying to learn about what the neuroscience behind this might be. I'm curious about it. But there is a way in which somehow we must be able to engage other parts of our brain to influence that pleasure pain balance in order to break that cycle, as powerful as that cycle is, and as much as we can become slaves to that cycle. Does that make sense?
Yeah, I'm struggling a bit.
Yeah. Well,
I think you're trying. I think it's
yeah.
you're trying to articulate something that's spiritual and in nature, and it can be complicated to do that. I guess I'm understanding that by stepping outside of this, just what I see in front of me world, in my case as a Christian, it's my contact with God and with the
Right.
forgiveness that he's given me,
That's right.
and the his grace towards me, even though I don't deserve it, and his I mean, there's so much in the Bible that I connect with the fact that
Right.
he was condemned, that
Right.
he was he lost control. All of his
Right.
friends abandoned him, like
Yeah.
and he became sin.
Mhm.
And so whatever I experienced as the result of things I did to myself, I
Mhm.
know that he experienced that.
Right.
And having that friendship and that
Right.
relationship with that savior has been something that does give me incredible strength
Right.
to not go back to bad patterns.
Yeah. And that's really fascinating, right? Like wow, like what's happening in the brain
Mhm.
when that happens, right? Like what are your neurons doing when you are receptive to that awareness and that connection with God? I mean, it's really interesting.
Mhm. Yeah. Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, I'm interested in exploring more of that too.
Mhm.
Um, I did want to address a little bit this idea of a dopamine fast, or a dopamine kind of break from things. I had a couple of questions about that. Can you
Yeah.
explain first what that is, and how it's helpful in breaking addiction?
Sure. So first of all, again, with repeated bombardment of our reward pathway with these highly reinforcing drugs and behaviors, we eventually end up in this dopamine deficit state as our brains try to compensate for way too much dopamine than we were designed to handle. But the idea is that with enough abstinence from our drug of choice, so taking a break from that drug of choice, and enough neuroplasticity, which, most people have throughout life. Those gremlins will hop off, homeostasis will be restored, we'll start to, make our own dopamine again, start making our own dopamine receptors, and we'll be able to get out of that place of constant craving, irritability, anxiety, dysphoria, widen our lens, be present in the moment, not be constantly craving and thinking about our drug. We still might, especially if triggered, but much better. And essentially then also be able to enjoy other more modest rewards. So the dopamine fast is the 30-day break from your drug. The 30 days is important for a number of different reasons. It's probably the minimum amount of time it takes for the gremlins to hop off and for dopamine homeostasis to be restored. It's also an amount of time that people can psychologically wrap their heads around. They're willing to sign up for that, like in the broad scheme of your life. Could you give me 30 days? And most people, it's hard to argue against 30 days. If you say you should never drink again, it's like, well, no, I'm not going to sign up for that. Okay, can you not drink for 30 days? And it's the intervention I just used increasingly over my, 20 plus years of psychiatric clinical experience, because it works. People are very often willing to do it if they're able to do it. And they can get through, especially those first 2 weeks where they're feeling worse before they feel better. Then I don't have to persuade them anymore that the project of either stopping or moderating their drug use is a worthy one, because they've seen the benefits themselves. Now 30 days is not typically it's not like all your problems are solved at 30 days. And many people will choose to try to go back to using in moderation and find that they can't do it and have to go around that cycle a couple times before they land on abstinence, lifetime abstinence as the right path for them. But nonetheless, I think this 30-day model is a good entryway. It's kind of an experiment, and I frame it that way. And it's also important because, we're now living in a day and age when, for example, the smartphone is something that's inherently addictive, but which we all need to use. So we do have to think about moderation. We can't just say abstain forever. We have to think about, if we're going to moderate, what is that going to look like? And as I always say to my patients, if your long-term goal is moderation, you need to start with abstinence first. It's much better and more successful to go from heavy use to abstinence to moderate use than it is to try to go from heavy use to moderate use. That just doesn't work. And the reason it doesn't work is because you never reset reward pathways. Whereas if you stop for 30 days, the gremlins hop off, you reset reward pathways, you're starting with a level balance, and then you're much more likely to be successful as you go into the goal of moderation.
That's very interesting.
And again, let me emphasize though that moderation isn't for everybody, right? But yeah. But when I'm first working with people, I need to buy time and I need to get them to see. And oftentimes that 30-day absence is sort of a good doorway in.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I want to follow up on that, but I also have some specific questions about this dopamine fast. People who come to our recovery groups are getting sober from opioids, from alcohol, and all kinds of things. But the people who are struggling with sugar and processed foods and pornography and smartphones complain it is much more difficult to completely fast from these things, since you have to eat, or since I may be married to someone. And so what does a dopamine fast mean? Does it mean I'm not looking at pornography? Does it mean I'm not sexual? Does it mean I'm on some rigid diet that I'm only eating certain kinds of foods and not others? Do I put away my smartphone for a month? How do we cleanse from detox from these things that are not, in some ways, not as easy to just put to one side as a substance is.
Right. No, it's absolutely true. And it's why the discussion of moderation and self-binding, becomes so important. So let's take food to start with. Obviously, we're not recommending that people not eat for 30 days. That would not be the recommendation. But the recommendation would probably be that, they cut out sugar and they cut out processed food and they cut out, empty carbohydrates. So they cut out the drugified foods, or the foods that they find once they start eating, they can't stop, or the foods that once they start eating, they're triggered to want to eat, their cakes and cookies. And AA and other 12 steps, they have a nice diagram for this where they have like a target where you do 3 concentric circles. And in the middle circle, you put the things that are, your drug of choice. So cakes and cookies, right? Or masturbating to pornography, or TikTok on my phone, right? Those are things which those are the things I'm going to abstain from 30 days, right? That's the drug. Then in that middle ring, you put the things that are triggers, like, for some people, if their goal is to eliminate alcohol, but they find that if they smoke a cigarette socially, they crave alcohol, or if they drink coffee, or they crave a cigarette, or whatever it is. So then you would eliminate the things that trigger you, the things that, and it might not even be a substance. It might be a person or a place or something like that. And then in that outer ring, you put the behaviors that are healthy. So that might be for someone with sex addiction, it might be, sex with my partner. Although when we're dealing with sex addiction, we recommend no orgasms with ourselves or others for 30 days. So that's like that doesn't mean no orgasms ever or celibacy, although for some people that, extended celibacy is helpful. But then it might be, going from no orgasms at all to, okay, sex with my partner, but no masturbation, or maybe sex with my partner and masturbation, but no pornography. Everybody is going to maybe define it in a slightly different way. Same thing with the smartphone. Maybe I can go on the smartphone to text, but I can't use any apps, or I can just use the phone function, but no texting. That would be their 30-day. So I think, but it's starting with really eliminating that drug or behavior that we find we have that conflicted relationship with. And once we start, we can't stop, or our use leads to problems, or it leads to us feeling worse as we're doing it and afterwards. That's the thing we eliminate for 30 days. And then, tweak it as we go along.
Okay, that's very helpful. I want to go back to, you mentioned sort of talking with clients, and they're better able to accept 30 days than a lifetime. They're sort of negotiating with clients. And a couple of things kind of come to mind with that. One is just the stance of motivational interviewing, and that, you're working with people who have ambivalence about whether or not to quit. And so maybe bringing down what the initial ask is,
right,
can help with that. But also, I saw that you had a pretty traditional view of lying and denial, whereas motivational interviewing often says really denial is something that's created by the therapist by not acknowledging the other side of their ambivalence, that addicts are not necessarily any more devious or untruthful than other folks. It's just when you don't honor that side of their ambivalence. My experience with folks that I'm talking to are like, oh, I totally lied. Lying. So I'm just curious what your thoughts are about the utility of motivational interviewing, and how lying and denial, how do you see that stuff?
Yeah, I mean, the funny thing about motivational interviewing is, like, before it came out as sort of a codified approach, it's sort of pieces of psychotherapy that we've been doing for decades. And that's true
Rogers
for yeah, right, exactly. I mean, very helpful to have it kind of stripped down to these fundamentals, and especially, as teaching sort of people who aren't trained necessarily in psychiatry and don't get years of that, and so need the condensed version, really useful. It's absolutely true that if you create a safe space for people to tell the truth, and then you ask them a direct question, yeah, my experience is that people will then potentially more likely tell the truth. Of course, I still have people, who lie, because it's really can be really hard to admit that we've relapsed, or that, whatever we're doing. But I still think that there is that this brain function of denial is really real, in that until that moment when we are telling another person what we've done, it really isn't real to us in a very palpable way. And that it's only really when we say it out loud. It's almost like quantum physics. It's like you can know the location, but you can't know the wavelength at the same time. There is this funny way in which when we say it out loud, it comes into relief in a way that it just doesn't until that moment. So I think that there's both of those things really are true, but I think getting folks to really say what they're doing can be an aha moment, even though they know it, right? And if you ask them, they would be able to tell you, yes, I did that, and yes, I was lying about it. But there again is this very powerful way in which it can remain hidden in the recesses, even when we know it, we don't know it in the same way.
Yeah. Yeah. Christianity certainly has some things to say about the human heart and how devious it can be and who can know
Yeah,
it.
right.
And I've also heard stories of people who said, in church, we go through this liturgy every week. We confess our sins and then we receive absolution. It wasn't until I came to a meeting and said out loud to somebody else, or it wasn't until I told my wife
Right.
that, just for some reason, just the quietude of me and God, I
Yeah.
was able to continue to justify it, or it wasn't real,
Right.
or whatever. But something about confessing it out loud to another person
Yes. Kind of
made a
crystallizes it. Yeah.
made a shift for sure.
Yeah.
Interesting. Oh, for sure. One of the things I wanted to talk about, just in terms of the dopamine, was this idea that when you're cued to it, when you're cued to the thing that you are craving, or that you become addicted to, and you don't get the substance,
Yeah.
it it actually makes the cravings or the subsequent down turning of the level worse. Can you talk a little bit
Yeah.
about that?
Yeah, so this is based on these really great experiments in rats. I mean, it's kind of cruel to the rats, but anyway, the findings are interesting, where a probe is stuck in the rat's brain to measure dopamine levels in real time. The rat is put in a cage, and the rat learns that if it presses a lever, it will get, for example, an immediate injection of cocaine into the bloodstream. So there's another wire going into the bloodstream that delivers cocaine, and a couple of different manipulations that have been very revealing. First of all, not surprisingly, when the rat presses the lever and cocaine is delivered, there's a huge increase in dopamine levels right in the reward pathway in the brain. But also, interestingly, um, when the rat is learns that if they see a light, that cocaine will be available if they press the lever, just seeing the light in and of itself leads to a slight increase in dopamine. So we get a little bit of euphoria by knowing that our drug is coming, followed by a little decrease in below dopamine baseline level. So a dopamine deficit state right after the cue, which is really interesting because it's that dopamine deficit state that drives the motivation and the willingness to work to get the drug, right? So the cue itself can replicate the cycle, the pleasure pain balance of euphoria, followed by this kind of dysphoria, which then drives repetitive use. But the other thing is that if you cue a rat to know that they're going to get a drug, they've learned that, and then they go and they press the lever, and then the cocaine that was expected is not delivered, there's a huge plummeting in dopamine levels far below baseline. And that's, so I think, really consistent with lived experience, that if you're expecting a reward that you don't get, it's much worse than if you had never expected it at all. And I think we can all kind of relate to that.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I'm thinking for somebody who's in those that initial 30 days, if they're cued to a substance
Yeah.
and they don't use it, maybe they're thinking, wow, I got through that. That might be a vulnerable time for them
Yeah.
immediately following that, because they were cued to the substance, they didn't give into it. That's
Yeah.
cool, but you might actually be now a little bit more susceptible to use. Maybe it's a good time to go to a meeting. Maybe it's a good
Yeah,
time
that's
to
right.
call your
That's exactly
sponsor.
right. Yeah, right. Yeah, and just recognizing that not only are external cues potentially, creating that cycle with the pleasure and pain, but even our own memories, right? Euphoric recall can do that too, where we kind of get a little bit of euphoria thinking about it. But what we're not as aware of is that in the aftermath of the euphoria, we're in a deficit state, and that then makes us very, very vulnerable.
Interesting. So I wanted, in the little bit of time we have left, if we do have a minute left,
Yeah.
just kind of explain to you what we do, something a little bit different than the 12 steps. And I'm just
Okay.
curious
Yeah.
what your thoughts are about this. So what we essentially do is a confession and absolution format. So we read a Bible verse or we look at something that Jesus did. We notice how we are not living up to what that's asking us to do. And we go around the room and we talk about that.
Yeah.
Once that's done, then we proclaim the forgiveness of Christ using a Bible verse that shows how he completed that work that we were unable to do and how we receive that. And then we talk about how, given the fact that we are forgiven, how should we live our life this week? And I'm just curious, from a neurobiological perspective, do you see what do you see happening there? What, anything that you think is missing in a format like that? What are your thoughts about that?
Well, it's interesting. I mean, it would be speculation on my part, but it sounds like a little bit. I mean, what can happen with the cycle of addiction and ending up in this dopamine deficit state is that we just feel lousy, right? And we've got this physiologic drive to use. We're irritable, we're anxious, we're depressed, and we're also feeling a lot of shame about what we're feeling. And that shame too can then, drive repeated use just so we can not feel, right, and not be in that uncomfortable place. And it sounds like what the work that you're doing, in a way, is almost like a reset of the pleasure-pain balance, where you use this theological frame to give people an opportunity to de-shame and potentially feel God's love, and with that maybe potentially reset the balance, which then gives them an opportunity to move forward, and make better choices in their lives. Because the whole thing is that when we're in that dopamine deficit state, where it's very hard, again, to be in control of what we're doing, right? But it sounds like somehow this process of forgiveness really allows people to sort of start from a level playing field and move forward, instead of feeling like they're just still kind of chasing the biology. I don't know if that makes sense.
Yeah, I think of it again in religious terms of being washed clean,
Yeah.
having a burden removed,
Right.
and of new life then.
Right.
So this old life dies when I
Right.
confess it, and now there's new life that can emerge from that. But we have just experientially noticed sometimes there's a high associated with
Right.
this, like, wow, we're forgiven. Wow, I cannot believe what
Yeah.
Jesus did for us.
Yeah.
And that the next day, sometimes we're a little bit more susceptible to
Interesting.
temptation.
Yeah.
And so we talk about praying, the God who's with us on the mountaintop, be with us in the valley too, because we
Right.
may experience a valley after this.
Right. I mean, and this is interesting. I mean, I think there's work being done, like, so people, you can sort of have these, I mean, there's dopamine released when people have these spiritual moments, right? This is sort of ontogenic awareness. Clearly that is reinforcing for humanity and releases dopamine in the brain, and potentially, I guess, could be addictive too, if it's sort of adulterated in some way, although I think it's really highly adaptive and gives people who are in a dopamine deficit state some temporary relief, right? Just like maybe using a drug would give them relief. If they can have this sort of group, especially a group or even individual spiritual moment, they probably get some dopamine from that, and again, level the playing field. But you're right, that's, if it takes time, you can't just have one of those and be good, right? There, you have to give enough time abstinent from the drug for the brain to fully adapt. But it is interesting to think about the ways in which that does provide at least some temporary relief. I guess the key there would, yes, to be warn people, like, you're going to temporarily feel relief, but it's a long, hard road, and you have to be patient for the balance to sort of fully restore, homeostasis.
Yeah, and I think what we talked about before with thinking of the Lord as a shepherd that's going to guide us through the valleys as well.
Yeah.
So what's next? I thought I heard in a podcast that you were going to explore a bit more the ideas of spirituality and religion in terms of addiction.
That's what I'm at the very beginnings, but I'm thinking about it. I don't know for sure. I'll see where it leads, but
things are just kind of germinating right now.
Yeah. I mean, I wanted, spirituality and spiritual transformations are such an important part of recovery, and also, I just am really curious about the intersection between spirituality and science.
Mhm.
And so just wondering, what's out there. And so that's maybe what I write about next. We'll see.
Uh-huh.
I don't want to promise anything.
Right. Yeah, well, I would encourage you. I just felt as I read the book, I was like, well, here's someone who's not opposed to spirituality,
Yeah, right.
who's very interested in science and very interested
Yeah.
in what's happening on a mechanistic and materialistic level,
Yeah.
but very clearly open to people's spirituality and both
Yeah.
ways in which the church has been condemning and unhelpful, and
Yeah.
ways in which spirituality and religion can be very helpful to people as well.
Yeah.
So it's just exciting to read, like,
Oh, good.
oh, she's
Well,
got the
maybe you and
science
I can
really
talk.
down.
Yeah, maybe you and I can talk more then at some point offline as I get further along in my research.
Yeah, absolutely.
Because
Yeah,
I am curious about this model that you have and how it might work.
yeah, there's so much we could talk about. But I also
Yeah.
had, like you had mentioned, confession and then a prescription of what to do after that,
Yeah,
right?
right.
And as
right.
Protestants, it's very much not what we do.
Interesting.
So you ask for forgiveness. Forgiveness is a free gift to you.
Got it.
And now it's a question of how it's no longer I've got to, it's an I want to,
Yes.
because I'm so in love with this person that has done this thing for
Got
me
it.
that it
Yeah.
flows out of me, but it's
Yeah.
not a prescription.
So that's very interesting. Yeah. And even just the experience of God as love is interesting to me because I'm not sure everybody experiences that,
For
and
certain they don't.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So I'm wondering, is there a way to participate in a spiritual pathway without necessarily feeling God's love? I think there must need to be, because I don't think everybody is wired for that feeling.
Interesting.
Yeah.
Yeah, I would love to chat some more.
Yeah, we will have to do that. Okay, I gotta go.
Yeah,
thank you
so much for your time.
You're welcome. Take
I
care.
appreciate it.
Yeah,
Bye.
In this world I live behind, thought I'm on my way to